The funeral was crowded. The air was thick with sorrow. It was a small church. The pews were packed. Mourners dressed in black, their faces grim. The coffin, heavy and solemn, sat at the altar. A single flicker of a candle cast eerie shadows on the walls. And there, in the front row, sat the family. They looked different. Their faces were void of the tears one would expect. Their eyes cold, as if rehearsing. The widow sat closest to the coffin, her hand limp at her side, her gaze fixed ahead, but there was no emotion in it. The pallbearers were strange too, their eyes darting nervously, almost as if they didn't belong. The whole room felt wrong, suffocating. An uneasy silence filled the space. But it wasn't the silence of grief. It was something else. Something darker. The priest stood at the pulpit, his voice steady, but even his words seemed to shake. "May he rest in peace," he said, his eyes lingering on the widow. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Then, a woman in the second row gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes widened, horror consuming her. She looked at the widow. Then she whispered, too quietly for anyone else to hear. The widow's eyes flickered, briefly, like she knew something was wrong. Her lips parted, and the faintest smirk crossed her face. But no one else saw it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there. And then, a shrill scream erupted from the back. The mourners turned, startled. A man had collapsed, clutching his chest. His body twitched violently. The widow didn't flinch. The priest, too, seemed unmoved. As the man's body was dragged from the church, something strange began to unfold. People began to whisper. Not of loss, not of grief, but of betrayal. Of secrets buried too deep to ever resurface. The family wasn't here to mourn. They were here to keep up appearances. The truth was darker than anyone had imagined. And as the coffin was lowered into the ground, the chilling truth began to unfold. The widow had a secret, a deadly one, and it was too late for anyone to stop it now. The ground swallowed the coffin slowly. The mourners stood, stiff, unmoving. The priest muttered final words, but his voice was distant, detached. The widow never took her eyes off the grave. Her fingers twitched, but no tears came. The family shuffled around her like shadows, close but not touching. The sky above was heavy, overcast, but no rain fell. Just a thick, oppressive stillness. The whispers began again, this time louder. People exchanging looks, sensing the discomfort that now clung to the air. "Did you see that?" someone murmured. That look she gave. The man who had collapsed was still in their minds, his face pale, his breath ragged. It hadn't been a heart attack. The doctors had said it was something else. Something worse. The widow's gaze flickered toward him, then away. Her lips twisted into a faint smile, almost mocking. A chill ran through the crowd, a collective shiver. The family stood too still, as if they were waiting for something. The earth was heavy under their feet, like it wanted to keep the secrets buried. No one dared speak of it yet, but everyone felt it. The funeral was not an end. It was a beginning. Something had been set in motion. Something darker than death itself. As the last of the mourners filtered out, only a few remained, those closest to the widow. They exchanged no words, but the tension was thick, unbearable. The priest lingered at the door, eyeing them cautiously, as though he too had begun to understand. Then the widow turned. Her eyes locked on him, and for the first time, he saw the truth in them. Cold, calculating, ruthless. And just before the last mourner disappeared into the night, she whispered, so quietly no one else could hear, "It's done." And in the silence that followed, the world seemed to pause. No one moved. No one breathed. The truth had been buried, but the consequences were only beginning. And in the shadows of that small, empty church, the killers walked free, their masks still firmly in place. The church doors creaked shut behind the last mourner. The silence that followed was suffocating, like the air had thickened with secrets too heavy to bear. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches of the trees that surrounded the graveyard. But inside, nothing stirred. The widow remained standing by the altar, her eyes unwavering, as if she were still watching the coffin descend into the earth. Her family was still there, but they were no longer a family. They were something else. Something darker. The priest lingered at the doorway, his hand on the handle, but he didn't leave. He couldn't. Something told him to stay. Something in the air told him that his role in this wasn't over. As the last mourners disappeared into the fog, the widow turned to face him. Her footsteps were silent, gliding across the worn stone floors, her eyes never leaving his. The priest's heart began to race, a subtle dread creeping up his spine. "You are never supposed to be part of this," she whispered, her voice low, dangerous. The priest's throat tightened. He knew then, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that he had been wrong to believe this was an ordinary funeral. The woman he had just prayed for was no mourner. She had been the cause of death. The widow took a slow step forward, her face unreadable. "Why?" the priest managed to choke out, his voice a hoarse whisper. She smirked, but it wasn't a smile. It was something cold. "Because," she said, "this is just the beginning." And with that, she turned away. But as she walked past him, she whispered again, quieter this time, "We've already won." The priest stared at her, his breath shallow. He wanted to reach out, to stop her, but he knew it was too late. The killers were still here. They were all around him. The widow's family filed out silently, like ghosts, their faces masks of indifference. And as the last of them disappeared into the night, the priest could only stare after them. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized the truth. He had walked into a trap. And now, there was no way out. The murderers had masqueraded as mourners. But the truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. The quiet church stood empty, and the wind howled outside. But inside, something far more sinister lingered. And it wasn't done yet. The door to the church slammed shut, leaving the priest in the growing darkness. His heart raced, but his feet felt heavy, as though the floor had become one with his soul, pulling him deeper into the silence. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of what he had witnessed. The widow, her family, they weren't just mourners. They were the architects of something far worse than death. He stumbled toward the door, but his hands, trembling, couldn't grasp the handle. The weight of their presence still filled the room, thick and suffocating. His breath was shallow now, the air growing colder with every passing second. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the cemetery whole. He could barely make out the stone markers, their shapes barely visible in the mist. He forced himself to move toward the exit, desperate to leave, but something kept him rooted in place. It was as if the church itself was holding him prisoner. A low, haunting sound echoed from behind him. A whisper? A laugh. The priest spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. But there was nothing. Nothing but the dark, empty pews. Then another sound. A faint scraping, like nails dragging across the floor. He turned toward the altar, where the widow had stood only moments ago. Her presence was still there, lingering in the air. The priest's pulse quickened as the scraping sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple. A chorus of whispers, too soft to make out, but unmistakable. And then, the cold air thickened, coiling around him like a chain. The altar flickered with a pale, sickly light. It wasn't the candle's glow. It was something worse. A shadow moved in front of him. The priest's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now. They were still here. In the shadows, standing just out of view, was the widow. But she wasn't alone. Her family stood behind her, their faces pale and hollow, eyes hollowed out by something darker than grief. They were watching him. They weren't just people anymore. They were something else. Something he couldn't describe. And as they stepped forward, the priest took a step back, his legs shaking beneath him. He had been too late to stop it. He was trapped. The family closed in on him, their steps eerily synchronized, moving as one. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The last flicker of candlelight dimmed. And in the silence that followed, the priest knew. He had just become a part of their story. the last victim. The murderers had masqueraded as mourners. But the true horror had just begun. The church felt like a tomb now. The air was thick, suffocating. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching for the priest. He could feel them, pressing in from every direction. His breath hitched, his throat dry, his eyes darting wildly. The widow stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes locked with his, and for the first time, he saw the full depth of what she was. There was no grief in her, no remorse. She was a predator, and he was her prey. "Do you know what it's like?" she whispered, her voice a low, chilling hum. "To be freed from the burden of morality." Her words sliced through him, cold and sharp. The family moved with her, like shadows in the dark. The priest took another step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please," he gasped, his voice trembling. This can't be happening." She smiled, a cruel twist of her lips. "Oh, but it already is." The family closed in tighter, surrounding him like a pack. His back hit the cold stone wall of the church, but there was no escape. The widow reached out and traced her finger lightly across his cheek, as if savoring the fear in his eyes. "We didn't want you here," she continued, her voice soft, almost affectionate. "But now that you are, well, you can be part of the family." Her hand moved down his neck, cold as death itself. The priest recoiled, his mind racing, but his body was paralyzed by terror. "They didn't die by accident, Father," she continued, her smile widening. "They never do." The priest's heart skipped a beat as realization hit him. The man who had collapsed at the funeral. The strange behavior of the mourners. It had all been carefully orchestrated. He had thought he was there to give comfort, to ease the grieving family. But now he was just another piece in their game. Why me?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The widow's gaze softened for a moment, though it was far from kind. "Because," she said, her voice laced with dark amusement, "you were the last one to see the truth and live." A deep, terrible laugh bubbled from the family. It echoed in the empty church, bouncing off the walls like a ghost. And then, in an instant, the air turned cold. The shadows in the corners of the church seemed to come alive, swirling with a life of their own. The priest's heart hammered against his chest as he looked at the faces surrounding him, their hollow eyes and empty expressions. They were waiting. For what? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. He was no longer a witness. He was no longer a priest. He was a victim. The family closed in. And the last thing the priest saw before everything went black was the widow's smile, sharp and predatory. The last thing he felt was her cold hand at his throat. And then nothing. In the quiet aftermath, the church was still. But the truth had been buried beneath the stone and the shadows. And the murderers, still masquerading as mourners, walked free. The church remained silent, an unnatural stillness hanging in the air. The only sound now was the faint echo of the wind outside, pressing against the stone walls. The priest's body lay motionless, crumpled on the cold, hard floor. His eyes were open, unseeing. The widow and her family stood over him, their faces lit by the faint, flickering glow of the candles. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were waiting for something. The family looked down at him with cold detachment, as if the priest had simply been a part of their game. A piece that no longer served a purpose. The widow's eyes flickered toward the door, where the last light from the outside world barely touched the threshold. She smiled, a slow, satisfied curve of her lips. "Now," she murmured, her voice cold and calm. "We wait for the others." Her words were almost a lullaby, soft but heavy with meaning. One by one, the family turned and walked toward the door. Their steps were silent, deliberate, but each one carried a sense of finality. The widow lingered for a moment, gazing down at the priest's lifeless body as though savoring the moment. A final piece in their puzzle. And then, with a soft click, the door swung open. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the graveyard, the trees, and the path leading away from the church. But the widow and her family didn't hesitate. They stepped into the fog, blending into its cold embrace, their figures melting into the mist like shadows in the night. And as they disappeared into the darkness, the church stood empty once more. The priest's body was still there, but now it was just another casualty in a story that had no end. The truth had been buried deep within the walls of the church, concealed by its ancient stones and haunted by the whispers of the dead. But the widow and her family had gone. Their task was done for now. They had masqueraded as mourners, played their parts, and vanished. Yet somewhere in the distance there were more to be claimed. The murderers were still out there, their masks firmly in place. And no one would ever truly know who they were. The fog rolled in thicker. And the church waited. The fog outside thickened, creeping into the very bones of the church, as though the night itself had come to claim what was left behind. Inside, the silence was almost unbearable. The priest's body lay untouched, his wide, glassy eyes staring at nothing, but somehow seeing everything. His lips, frozen in a silent scream, a final plea for mercy that had gone unanswered. The church was still, but the air was heavy, as if the very walls knew what had happened and were now holding their breath. Minutes passed, then hours. But in the stillness, something stirred. The wooden pews groaned as though shifting, though no one was there to move them. A small flicker of candlelight caught the edge of the altar, casting a strange, wavering shadow across the room. Something had changed. Somewhere, deep beneath the earth, a sound echoed, soft at first, barely perceptible. Then louder. A scraping. The faintest movement of dirt. A whisper of wind. And then, a soft thud. The ground had begun to shift. The crypts beneath the church had stirred. And within them, the dead were not as still as everyone had believed. But it wasn't the bodies of those long forgotten that stirred now. It was the souls of the living. The church, once a sanctuary, was now something else entirely.
A tomb.
A trap. A place where the dead never truly left. Where the living, if they were unlucky enough, could join them. In the distance, the faintest whisper of footsteps could be heard again. But they weren't from the widow or her family. They weren't even from the priest, still lying cold in the corner. These were different. Hushed. Deliberate. And there was something chillingly familiar about them. The door creaked open once more. Not with the soft squeak of the wind, but with the heavy sound of someone pushing it from the other side. The fog had seeped inside, curling around the edges of the church like a living thing, pressing into the dark corners. A figure appeared in the doorway.
Tall. Dark.
But their face, hidden by the hood of their cloak, was obscured in shadow. The figure stepped forward, their footsteps echoing with a cold precision. Each movement measured, calculated. They reached the altar and paused. The air felt different now, charged with something primal. A shift had occurred. The figure bent down and lifted something from the floor, a small, silver key. The same key the widow had used to lock the crypts below. The figure's eyes glinted with the reflection of the candlelight. They weren't alone. And they weren't a mourner. They were another piece of the puzzle. Another predator. And the game, as it had before, was about to begin again. This time, though, the stakes were higher. This time, the church had more to claim. The figure stepped toward the body of the priest, kneeling beside him. His death wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And as the figure turned, they dropped the silver key onto the floor with a soft, resonant clang. They didn't look back. But from the crypts beneath, something stirred again. Not a scraping, but a shuffling. A voice whispered, barely audible, from the dark recesses of the church. "Is it time?" The figure nodded. And the doors, which had been closed for so long, began to open wider. Not to the night, but to something else. Something that waited below. The crypts of the church had always held their secrets. But now, those secrets were clawing their way to the surface. And there was no stopping them. The church groaned, as though it could feel the stirring beneath its foundations, the quiet shuffling of things long buried. The figure stood motionless, watching as the shadows lengthened in the dim candlelight, the air thick with the promise of something unspeakable. Behind them, the heavy doors swung wider, the hinges creaking with an eerie resonance that sent a shiver down the spine. The fog crept in more rapidly now, seeping into the very walls, as though it were alive, hungry to consume everything in its path. The figure turned and took one slow, deliberate step forward, the silver key still clutched in their gloved hand. The faint sound of muffled voices echoed from below, rising through the floorboards, distant yet unmistakably human. "Is it time?" came the whisper again, clearer this time. The figure nodded once, slowly, their face still concealed in shadow. "Yes," they said, their voice low, raspy, but filled with authority. "It's time." The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, a vibration that hummed through the stone floor and into their very bones. The priest's body, cold and lifeless, seemed almost to twitch as though responding to the call. The figure turned toward the altar, where the once still form of the priest lay, eyes wide and unseeing. The very air seemed to thicken around him, pressing in from all sides. The smell of old, stale incense mixed with the unmistakable scent of earth and decay. They knelt by the priest's side and whispered something under their breath. Words that carried a weight beyond language, words that should not have been spoken in this world. And with those words, the priest's body jerked once, sharply. His fingers twitched. His mouth opened with a low, guttural rasp. For a moment, it seemed as though he was waking. But it was not life that returned to him. It was something far darker, something older. His eyes flickered, but they were no longer his own. They were empty, black voids, pits that absorbed the light around them, leaving only an abyss behind. The figure stood and stepped back, watching intently. The priest's body rose from the floor with unnatural, jerky movements, his neck cracking as he turned his head slowly, deliberately toward the figure. Then, the thing that had once been a man spoke, its voice low and hollow, as if it had risen from the depths of the earth itself. "Why have you awakened me?" it rasped. The figure did not answer immediately. They only watched the priest know whatever he had become closely. There was a moment of tension, an invisible line drawn between them. Finally, the figure spoke, their tone icy and resolute. "Because it's time," they said. "The others are coming. It's time to finish what was started." The priest, no, the creature, made a sound, something between a grunt and a laugh, low and mocking. The sound reverberated off the church's stone walls. "Then it begins again," it whispered, almost to itself. The figure stepped toward the crypt entrance, the silver key glinting in their hand. The door groaned under its own weight, the air thickening, pressing inward like a living thing. The figure turned to the priest. "You know what to do." The creature's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but it was a twisted, inhuman thing, a mockery of the human expression. "Of course," it said, voice dripping with malice. And then, just like that, the church seemed to exhale. The doors of the crypt began to open, slowly, as though reluctant to reveal what was hidden within. The whispers from below grew louder, more urgent, a cacophony of voices all pushing to be heard. And from beneath the church, the ground trembled again. This time, the tremor was not subtle. It was a violent shake that rattled the windows and knocked the candles from their stands, plunging the room into near total darkness. The air grew colder, impossibly so, as if something from the very bowels of the earth was rising up. And then, from the shadows, they began to emerge. Figures, shrouded in black. They were tall, too tall, and their faces were hidden beneath layers of fabric, their eyes glowing faintly from within their hoods. They moved with the same unnatural grace as the widow and her family had, their footsteps silent on the stone floors. The figure with the key stepped back, nodding as the other figures took their places, forming a circle around the priest. The creature's head tilted to one side, watching the dark shapes surround it. "It's time," it repeated. And as the crypt doors opened fully, the figures began to chant.
Low.
Rhythmic. A language older than time itself. And beneath the floorboards, something stirred. The murderers had never truly left. They had merely waited. Now they were ready. The church was no longer a sanctuary. It was a temple, And they, the ones who had once masqueraded as mourners, were the gods. And the world was about to learn the price of their silence. The chanting grew louder, their voices a chorus that echoed through the walls, reverberating like an ancient, forgotten prayer. The floor beneath the priest's body seemed to pulse with the rhythm, as if the church itself were alive, responding to the dark call from deep below. The creature that had once been the priest lifted its head, its eyes glowing now, no longer mere black voids, but filled with something darker, more terrifying. A presence. It was no longer bound to the physical world. It was a vessel, a conduit for something much older. The figures around it continued their chant, their hands raised to the ceiling, each syllable spoken in a tongue that twisted the air, warping it, bending it to their will. As the final syllable of their chant echoed, the air in the church grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure. A violent gust of wind slammed against the door, and the walls trembled, as if struggling to contain the force rising from beneath. From deep within the crypt, something responded. Something vast. Something ancient. The very earth groaned as if protesting the rising power. And then the ground cracked. The crypt doors, unable to hold back the pressure, splintered open with a thunderous crash. A blinding, white light burst from the crypt, flooding the church, searing the shadows, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The figures around the creature stood firm, unfazed by the sudden burst of energy. They had seen this before. The creature's mouth opened in a soundless scream, its body shaking violently as the light consumed it. Its form flickered, shifting between human and something far more monstrous, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and shadow. The key, still in the figure's hand, glinted as it was raised once more. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just the earth that shook. From the depths of the crypt, a presence rose, a force so immense, it seemed to fold the very air around it. Something long forgotten, something that had waited for centuries, perhaps millennia, to be unleashed. The air turned icy, suffocating. The candles flickered, and the shadows on the walls danced wildly, distorting the space. The figures around the altar began to circle, their hands extended, their voices raised in unison. They were not just summoning a being from the depths, they were calling it home. And then, from the swirling mist of the crypt, it emerged. A shadow. A figure too tall to fit into the human frame, its outline obscured by an unnatural, swirling darkness. It was an entity from another world, from a time before human existence, its form ever-shifting, ever-changing. No mortal eyes could fully comprehend its shape, its purpose, its existence. But its presence was undeniable. It was here, and it was hungry. The priest's body, now animated by the dark force, stood at the altar, its hollow eyes staring as the creature materialized fully before them. There was no recognition, no emotion in its gaze, just an unyielding, empty hunger. The creature's voice, deep and resonant, vibrated the very air around them. Asterisk, you have summoned me, asterisk. The words were not spoken. They were felt. The figures bowed low, their faces hidden beneath their hoods, their movements synchronized in perfect devotion. The creature, this ancient entity, looked down at them, then slowly turned its gaze toward the congregation of figures, then toward the doors that had once served as the boundary between this world and the next. You have served well, it said, its voice echoing in every corner of the church, rippling through the floorboards and into the very soul of the building itself. The figures did not speak. They waited, silent and still. The church quaked again, as the dark being took its first step toward the open doors, its every movement sending tremors through the stone. The air was thick, suffocating. And as it moved toward the exit, toward the world beyond, the very ground beneath its feet shifted. The doors that had once been thrown wide now slammed shut. The mist outside had thickened, swirling around the church in a violent vortex, pushing inward as if the very fog had a will of its own. And with one final step, the creature paused, its dark form filling the doorway. Then it turned back toward the figures. Asterisk the world is not yet ready, asterisk. With that, the door closed behind it, and all was still again. The figures, the creature, and the church locked in time. But above, the night was not as it had been. The clouds shifted. The world outside trembled. The murderers, now free, had only just begun. The world outside was changing. The night, once thick with fog, was now alive with motion, an unnatural twisting of the air, as if the heavens themselves were warping to accommodate what had been unleashed. The church stood in eerie stillness, but the ground around it churned, restless. The presence that had entered the church, the dark entity from beyond the veil, was not gone. It lingered, its influence stretching far beyond the walls of the crumbling building. Something deep within the earth stirred, as if waking from a long slumber. The air was electric with tension, a palpable weight that pressed against everything, holding it in place. Yet, the ground beneath the church was trembling with a slow, rhythmic force. Every inch of the earth seemed to be cracking, breaking open in ways that no human eye could comprehend. Within the church, the figures who had summoned the creature still stood motionless, locked in their devotion. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the faint sounds of the earth shifting beneath their feet. The priest's body, now merely an empty vessel, lay sprawled across the altar, his eyes still dark pools of nothingness. His skin was cold, his limbs stiff, but there was a pulse within him, something beyond life, something that felt like a distant echo of death. Then, with a sudden, unnerving sound, the ground beneath him cracked open. The altar split down the middle, stone shards scattering in every direction. The figures didn't move, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods, but the sound, the thunderous crack of the earth, was unmistakable. From the cracks in the altar, a faint light began to bleed through. It wasn't the pure, radiant light of the heavens. No, this light was dark, twisted, like a shadow made of flame. The light pulsed, slow at first, then faster, like the beating of a heart. And with every pulse, the earth trembled more violently, as if the very foundations of the church could not bear the weight of what had been unleashed. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered. The air grew colder. The creature's presence was felt everywhere now, thick and suffocating. And then the voice. It was not one voice. It was many. A chorus of whispers, each one different, each one clawing at the edges of consciousness. Asterisk, you have awakened us. Asterisk. The words echoed from the cracks in the altar, reverberating in the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The figures didn't flinch. They didn't acknowledge the voices. They were beyond fear. The light grew stronger. And then, with a violent explosion of sound and fury, the stone of the altar shattered completely. The figures stepped back in unison, their movements synchronized, as from the heart of the altar emerged something that should not have been. A shape. A thing. It was not entirely solid, nor entirely formless. It was a writhing mass of shadow and flame, a twisted amalgamation of all that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. The creature, its true form, was vast, unfathomable. It rose from the depths, filling the church, casting its twisted light across the walls. Its shape seemed to shift with every blink, as if it were not bound by any law of reality, as though it were pulling itself out of nightmares long forgotten. The figures knelt before it, their heads bowed, and the church grew colder still, the temperature plunging to a point where breath turned to mist in the air. But there was no fear in their eyes, only reverence. And then the creature spoke again. Its voice was not a sound, it was a presence. Asterisk, now we take our place, asterisk. The words rang through the very fabric of existence. They were not just heard, they were felt. A deep, resonant force that seemed to shatter the boundaries between worlds. The creature turned toward the door, its eyes, or what could be called eyes, locking onto the now closed entrance. Asterisk, the world is ours to claim, asterisk. As if obeying its will, the door began to tremble. Slowly, hesitantly, the door creaked open again, revealing the chaos that had spread outside. The fog had thickened, swirling violently around the church, filling the night with a suffocating, unnatural density. The wind howled, but it was not a normal wind. It carried a weight, a force that bent the trees, snapped the branches, and rattled the leaves. It was as if nature itself was bending to the will of the creature. And then, the ground cracked wide open, and from the gaping chasm, the dark figures began to emerge. More figures. More shadows. The murderers. The ones who had once masqueraded as mourners. They stepped out of the mist, silent and deliberate. Their faces were obscured, but their presence was undeniable. There were dozens of them now, perhaps more. Their forms wavered in the fog, like mirages, shifting with an unnatural grace. The figures, the true disciples of the creature, moved in perfect synchrony, as if they were one entity, each step echoing the dark rhythm of their summoner's will. As the last figure stepped from the fog and into the church, the creature turned to face them. And the world, the very fabric of reality itself, seemed to bend. Time slowed. The air grew thick with tension. And then, the creature spoke, its voice a slow, terrifying whisper. Asterisk, it is time to finish what was started. Asterisk. The doors to the church slammed shut. And the hunt began. The doors of the church slammed shut with a deafening crash, reverberating through the walls, sealing the dark entity and its disciples within. The fog outside pressed against the church, a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to warp the very air. The ground outside cracked open further, as if something beneath was clawing its way to the surface. But inside, the silence was absolute. The figures stood motionless, their cloaked forms blending with the shadows in the corners of the room, their eyes glowing faintly from beneath their hoods. The creature, now fully materialized in its grotesque, ever-shifting form, loomed at the altar, its vast presence filling the room. Its form was a nightmare, an amalgamation of shadow and flame, a thing that should not have existed in this world. Every movement it made seemed to warp reality itself, stretching the air, bending light, distorting the space around it. It turned its head slowly, its many eyes flickering with an otherworldly hunger. "Do you feel it?" it whispered, its voice vibrating in the very bones of the church. "The world trembles. The walls are thin now. We are the walls." The figures did not respond. They were not meant to speak. They were only meant to serve. And serve they did. One by one, they moved in unison, their steps silent on the cold stone floor, their hands extended toward the creature. A ritual was unfolding, a dark symphony, a return to a time when gods were born from shadows and death. The creature raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers that crackled with energy, and the altar trembled. From the cracks in the floor, the whispers of the dead began to rise again, curling upward like smoke, twisting and writhing in the air. The smell of decay, of old blood and earth, filled the church, but there was something new now. Something far darker. The walls began to pulse, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, and the shadows grew thicker, creeping across the floor, crawling up the pews, covering every surface with their malignant touch. It was a creeping infection, a slow, deliberate infection that was consuming the church, the very air itself. The walls, once sturdy and strong, now seemed fragile, crumbling under the weight of what was being birthed here. "Bring them to me," the creature hissed, its voice like gravel scraping across stone. The disciples moved quickly now, their movements fluid and precise. They stepped toward the corners of the church, their hands raised as if beckoning something to rise. And rise it did. The floor cracked again, but this time it was not just the earth beneath the church that trembled. From the crypt below, from the very depths of the earth, the dead began to stir. The bodies of the long-forgotten, the lost and the buried, began to rise. Their forms were twisted, their flesh rotted, their eyes vacant, yet alive with the hunger of the void. They dragged themselves from their graves, their limbs stiff and unnatural, their mouths open in silent screams. The disciples surrounded them, guiding them forward, their faces impassive, their eyes hollow as they pushed the reanimated corpses toward the altar. The creature watched them, its many eyes narrowing, as the dead were arranged in a circle around it. "Let the ritual begin," the creature muttered, its voice vibrating through the church, filling the air with a dark promise. The disciples raised their arms, and in a single, synchronized motion, the chanting began again. A low, guttural hum that echoed through the walls, through the very air, through the earth itself. The words were unrecognizable, ancient beyond measure, spoken in a language that no living soul should ever have heard. The dead were arranged in a circle, their arms raised toward the creature, their mouths open in silent screams. And as the chanting grew louder, the shadows around them began to swirl, pulling tighter and tighter until the entire church was enveloped in a crushing darkness. And then a voice, deep, resonant, and terrifying, spoke again. "Now we feast." The light in the church dimmed as the shadows thickened, pulling the world into an oppressive, suffocating silence. The creature's form flickered once, twice, its many eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. The walls began to crack, the sound like the breaking of bones. The stone groaned as if under an unbearable weight, and the very foundation of the church seemed to shift beneath them. And then, with a sudden, violent force, the church trembled. The altar split down the center, shards of stone flying in all directions. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the ground buckled beneath the weight of the force rising from below. The dead, their bodies stiff and decaying, began to move again. They dragged themselves forward, their bodies twitching, their limbs jerking in unnatural movements. The creature's voice rang out again, this time with an inhuman, gurgling laugh. "Time has come. All will fall." With a final, earth-shattering crack, the floor gave way, and the dead poured forth. They swarmed like a tide, flowing over the altar, crawling toward the doors, the walls, every corner of the church. They surged forward with a single purpose:
To claim.
to consume. And as they surged toward the church doors, the last thing anyone would hear was the creature's voice, a dark promise. Let the world fall, and with that, the gates of hell opened. And the end began. The church was silent once more. The storm outside had calmed, but the air inside was thick with the weight of an ancient promise fulfilled. The fog had dispersed, but its remnants lingered in the corners of the church, clinging to the stone like a memory that refused to fade. The dead had stopped their endless shuffling. The creatures, once human, now mere shadows of their former selves, were still. Their vacant eyes stared out into the church, unblinking, yet there was no longer any malice in their gaze, only emptiness. The creature, the thing that had once been called a god stood at the center of the altar, its many eyes flickering with satisfaction. Its form was no longer shifting, no longer warping the reality around it. It had found its place in this world. And now there was no turning back. The figures, the disciples, who had once led the ritual, stood in a circle, their hands folded before them. They no longer needed to speak. Their devotion had been proven. They had called forth the darkness, and it had come. The widow, the last of the mourners, stood near the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with a kind of terror that no longer seemed to matter. She had known what was coming. She had been part of it. Yet, in this moment, she felt the full weight of what she had unleashed. The church felt heavier now. The very air was thick with the presence of something that was no longer alive, but not quite dead. It was as if the church itself had become a living tomb, a place between worlds where the dead walked and the living watched. There was no turning back. The church doors, once sealed so tightly, now swung open. The wind was still, the fog had receded, but the land beyond the church had changed. The sky was no longer bright with the promise of dawn, but dark, bruised, as though the heavens themselves had been torn open. The creature, its many eyes surveying the land, gave a final, satisfied exhale. "Now," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves, "we take what was promised. The world is ours." And with that, the earth beneath the church shifted. The ground cracked open once again, but this time, it was not the church that felt the tremor, it was the world itself. The skies darkened as if responding to the creature's will. The winds began to howl, but not with the gentle touch of nature, no. This was a howling, violent force, a storm of unimaginable fury. The widow, now trembling, stepped out into the church's doorway. She felt the cold, suffocating presence that had replaced the world she once knew. And then, with the last flicker of light in the distance, the earth opened, and the end came. A new age had begun, and there was no place for light in it, only shadow. The church, the land, the very air, all were claimed by the darkness that had once been bound below. And the world, as it had been, was gone. Forever. The murder season had only just begun.